once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. Good Books Radio is underwritten by audiobooks.com. Try one for free. Today, I am talking with Dr. Phil Zuckerman, who wrote the book Living the Secular Life. Dr. Zuckerman is a professor of sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. He's the author most recently of Faith No More and Society Without God, and blogs for Psych Today and Huffington Post. In 2011, Zuckerman founded an interdisciplinary department of secular studies at Pitzer College, the first in the nation. Dr. Zuckerman, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is an interesting read for both believers and non-believers. And one of the things that you mentioned early on is that no religion is the fastest growing religion in the U.S.
That's correct. This is something new here. We have never seen this many people in the United States, or the world for that matter, claiming to be non-religious. So just percentage-wise, I can just run you through some quick numbers. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, fewer than 5% of Americans, when asked what their religion was, said none, N-O-N-E, said they had no religion. That ticked up a little in the 90s. We were around 7-8%. By 2001, however, something was brewing. It was now suddenly around 13, 11, 12, 14%, depending on the study. By 2010, 11, it was up to 16%. Then last year, 19.5%. Now we're somewhere between 20 and, according to one Wynn Gallup poll, up to 30%. So somewhere between 20% and 30% of Americans are now saying they're non-religious, non-affiliated, none of the above. And we've never seen this before. It's definitely a sociological first.
Mm-hmm. And it appears that it's strongest in the Gen Y and the millennials. A third of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 are non-religious.
That's the biggest chunk, you bet. So you're 20-somethings, and it's quite a shift. 20 years ago, when 20-somethings, people between 18 and 29, were asked, their religious identification, twice as many said they were evangelical as said they had no religion. Twice as many. Mm-hmm. Now, in just 20 years, you've got the opposite. It's flip-flopped. Right now, among 20-somethings, the ratio is 2-to-1 non-religious to evangelical. So there's really been a big change in that younger generation, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you've done in this book is you've jutted the statistics up against some qualitative research. You've conducted in-depth interviews with a lot of non-religious people from all over the country, from all walks of life, and it paints an interesting picture of diversity. But some of the foundational components of the secular orientation seem to be virtuous and good, which surprises some religious folks, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot of motivation for writing this book was, there's a lot of stereotypes and prejudices out there that are pretty widespread in American society, which sort of equate secularism with being unpatriotic, being immoral, being angry. There's a lot of folks out there who sort of see secularism as a threat to civil society, and in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. By and large, secular culture is full of, as you said, values and virtues that are beneficial, that are benign, that are even helpful in a pluralistic democracy. And most secular men and women live their lives guided by very strong values and faith in each other, faith in family, faith in humanity, and basically live by a morality that's based on empathy. And the sociological data bears this out. So we simply see that there is no support whatsoever that correlates being irreligious with being immoral or criminal or anything like that. And I can unpack that if you like. But yeah, I really I felt that just like religious people must often get frustrated when the sort of more fanatical or fundamentalist or excessive folks get all the media attention, right? So people are, you got your average Christian who's out there just trying to live a loving life, be a good member of a family, is donating time and energy at a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter, and they're just living day to day in the way they think Jesus or Christ would want them to. And yet, what people think of as Christians is, these, sort of, hateful, judgmental, homophobic, et cetera, and that doesn't capture the reality. Well, you got the same Same thing happens in the secular camp. People tend to pigeonhole atheists as these angry people pontificating this and pontificating that and out to destroy religion. And yeah, there are a lot of secular folks out there that do have a gripe, do have a grudge, but your average, most secular men and women are living their lives peacefully, getting along just fine with religious folks, and don't have any desire to destroy it, and they're certainly not angry or immoral. So I wanted that to be known.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some qualities of the secular orientation, encouraging reasonable problem solving, fortifying oneself against groupthink, deepening an attachment to people and things of this world, a soulful appreciation of the majesty of nature, encouraging scientific inquiry and humane empathy. All of that sounds like a very nurturing approach, and yet so many folks expect something else. There was one point that I really appreciate. You said you weren't really going to be assaulting or deriding or condemning religion. That's already been done anyway. So
yeah.
That you wanted to get this on the ground perspective of people who are living the secular life and trying to fit into society.
Absolutely. I mean, the bottom line is religion provides so much that is good for human life. I mean, there's a reason that religion is so widespread in every culture the world over since time immemorial. I mean, religion provides morals and ethics and ethical guidelines. Religion provides answers to the riddles of meaning and life and death. It provides community, help with child care, rituals, traditions, you name it. So the question is, if we've got this growing number of people who saying they are not religious, who are opting out of church, they're not believing in God as much anymore, they're not participating, how are they getting these things? These things that are so fundamental. And so, yeah, my goal was not to write yet another book ripping apart this or that aspect of religion, but rather to shine a light on the everyday, on-the-ground lived experiences of people who have opted out of religion. And as you said, that culture is not a depraved, chaotic, despondent and depressed culture. It's a vibrant culture with many values and precepts and beliefs and principles, many of which you just named as right out of the book. So you got it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the morality of the secular view. I love the story of your dad and the dental assistant. She says, if you don't believe in God, how can you be a good person? And he cites Jiminy Cricket. I let my conscience be my guide. The golden rule is sort of the guiding principle that you hold forth primarily for the morality, isn't it?
Yeah, that seems to be the bottom line. For most secular people, morality is not about a list of do's and don'ts. It's not about reward and punishment per se. It's definitely not about obedience to a moral authority outside themselves, be it a preacher or a god. Secular men and women would consider that, in fact, moral outsourcing. If you're just sort of looking to a god to tell you how to live and how to be, you've sort of abdicated the personal responsibility involved in morality, which is really about making hard choices and decisions that affect other people in day-to-day life. And so what I found is, among the religious, there tends to be certain groupings of behaviors that, this is moral, that's immoral. You can do this, but you shouldn't do that. You can think about this, but you better not think about that. Whereas for secular people, it's really just one sentence. Morality is simply summed up in treat other people the way you want to be treated. Now, that golden rule is articulated in almost every world religion. It's quoted in the Gospels by Jesus, but it precedes. We find this articulation in ancient Egypt, in ancient China, in ancient Mediterranean, well before Judaism, Christianity, Islam even get off the ground. So that kind of just the basic empathetic reciprocity of treating other people the way we want to be treated, that seems to be the guiding principle of morality for secular men and women. But here's the rub, or here's the point rather. It seems to work. In other words, it's not some abstract philosophical thing that we can debate about. We can just simply look at the results. And what we find is that those societies where secular people are in the greatest abundance are among the most peaceful and moral and humane societies on earth today, with low murder rates, low violent crime rates, excellent health care and child care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even when I studied kind of secular men and women and how they raise their kids and the way they develop morality in their own homes and in their own families, it works. It's not perfect, just like no moral system is absolutely perfect. There's always going to be people who stray. But by and large, there is a vibrant moral core to secular humanism. In fact, professor at USC, just I could digress here, Vern Bankston wrote a book called Families and Faith. Vern Bankston, one of the largest studies of how religion plays out generation after generation. And they just recently started including secular families in their study because it's too unavoidable. And they were sort of surprised that in many instances secular parents were more articulate and more clear about various moral precepts than many of the secular parents in their studies. So, yeah, it's out there.
You know, you mentioned the Golden Rule from 600 years before the Common Era, but it's also true, and I think you said in your book, that the Golden Rule is some version of it's in all religions. Buddhism, Islam, doesn't matter. The Golden Rule is there.
Absolutely.
I like this moral outsourcing idea.
Yeah, I'm afraid. Well, that's nice. I'm worried I'm going to get in some trouble there. I mean, I'm happy to speak to that. Basically, yeah. I mean, let me give an analogy here. So, imagine soldiers are in a platoon and they've got a sergeant, and they've pledged to, they got to listen to their sergeant because he's in charge. And one day the sergeant says, well, tomorrow we're going to go to this village and distribute food and clothes to all these poor kids that have been bombed. Okay, the soldier obeys and does it. Well, the next day the sergeant said, hey, to this day we're going to this village and we're going to burn everything and kill everything that moves, man, woman, children. Well, the soldier obeys. Now, suddenly this soldier is functionally amoral. He's just doing what the sergeant says. So the sergeant may command something good one day or something heinous the next day, but the soldier isn't thinking for himself. He's not adhering to his own inner moral compass. He's simply obedient. And we wouldn't call such a soldier moral. We would call him obedient, just like my dog. We don't call a dog moral when it obeys our commands to sit or no or stand or sit. And what I find is that secular people believe that morality is something that you have to own yourself. You have to look inside, listen to your own conscience, and look at your own actions and how they're affecting other people. If you just get your morals from somebody else, it could be a pastor, a teacher, a politician, or even something invisible like God, you are, in a sense, yes, you're obeying a higher authority, which may have there's a time and place to do that in life, but if you're predicating your whole moral compass on what this external deity tells you, you're, in a sense, abdicating moral responsibility and just choosing obedience over moral deliberation. And thus, as one of my informants called it, that's moral outsourcing.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the eye in the ceiling of two kids going into a room with a precious treasure, and one of them is just asked to behave, and the other one is told that there's a camera on him and that they'll be able to see him every minute. And like in that second case, the eye in the ceiling to the outsourcing of morality.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. It's a bit like, if you tell someone, well, someone's watching you at all times, so you better behave. Well, if such a kid behaves, they're not really being moral. They're just being prudent. They're just, who wants to get busted by the big eye in the ceiling? A kid, on the other hand, who's told to behave and is given the reasons why and has said, ultimately, in the end, no one's watching here. It's really up to you. That child who does the right thing is actually is morally functioning at a higher level because they're actually self-motivated, not externally motivated. It's sort of like when I talk to my kids about lying, I tell them the consequences of lying. I tell them, hey, I don't say that's a sin. I don't say God is going to punish you. I don't say, the devil loves lies or whatever. I say, lying's not a good idea. Let me tell you why. There may be a time in life where you're going to need me to believe you, and it might be very crucial. But if you lie to me now, that's going to chip away at our trust. And if we don't have trust, what do we have? And we're a family. And when people lie to each other, it deteriorates relationships. It makes navigating life that much harder. So I try to explain to them why lying is wrong, not just simply punish them for lying. Mm-hmm. I might do that too. But for secular men and women, reward and punishment is a less durable source of morality than an internally motivated moral compass based on empathy and how other people feel.
Mm-hmm. Now, you cite some studies here about secular morality and religion versus irreligion. in regard to such things as racism and torture and some of the other things that really, I think, would surprise folks, how the stronger religious tend to be more racist. It's just surprising, some of that.
These are just averages.
Right.
My coffee hasn't kicked in yet. These are generalizations, so I don't want to get into this kind of compartmentalization. Religious people are this way and secular people are that way. These are just averages. It's always a continuum. There's always exceptions. But by and large, the study you referred to involved 55 studies, actually. A professor at USC looked at 55 studies looking at the relationship between religiosity and racism, and the surprise finding was that secular folks, particularly agnostics, register the lowest levels of racism, which, again, I agree, it's surprising. Take the issue of torture. A lot of Americans, a lot of Christians went and saw the Passion of the Christ, which was a very brutal movie to sit through. You watch the torture and excruciating pain inflicted on Jesus, and yet those same folks are more supportive of the governmental use of torture today than secular Americans and atheists. So there are a lot of one of my favorites is guns, and I know Americans love their guns, and that's all good and fine. I love the Second Amendment, but what's interesting is, Christianity is a religion of peace. It is a religion of nonviolence. That's undeniable. I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but that's the heart of the message there. Mm-hmm. And yet, who's most likely to own guns, own semi-automatic guns, are the more Christian, whereas secular Americans are actually the least likely to own guns and support guns. And again, I don't want to get into a whole right to bear arms issue, but in terms of as a weapon of violence, if secular people were sort of so immoral, you'd think they'd be sort of armed to the teeth, and Christians would be pacifists, and they wouldn't want to touch a gun to save their life. And yet we find these interesting paradoxes across the country that I wanted to alert Americans to seeing that, wow, we have these sort of stereotypes about secular people and religious people, but sometimes they're not based in reality, and in fact may even be the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Interesting also that the secular tend to support more women's equality as opposed to believing what women should obey their husbands, offering a path of legal citizenship to immigrants, underrepresented in our prisons, a lot of interesting things there. But the religious folks do score higher on generosity, volunteering, and charitable giving.
Absolutely. I mean, I do go out of my way to sort of trumpet the ways in which secular people thrive and do well and even do better than the religious, but I would be remiss to simply paint this picture of, secular culture is fantastic. It's not all perfect. It's not all popsicles and balloons. There are ways in which secular culture has its own challenges, and I can think of many examples. First of all, as you just already said, religious folks are much more likely to give to charities in terms of money and time. They're more generous on those levels than your average secular person. There's also higher rates of communitarianism and social capital among religious culture. People have more friends. They're more involved in groups. Secular culture tends to have higher rates of individualism, for better or for worse. Another one is just simply the way in which religious people help each other out during times of crisis. I interviewed a secular woman whose child died. And she found very little support. The secular culture didn't know how to deal with that. There wasn't an institutional way to provide for her comfort. And in fact, she ended up being invited to a women's prayer group down the street who were there to comfort her. She never found Jesus. She never accepted their faith, but she certainly appreciated the way in which they could deal with her grief in a much more pointed way than her secular friends and neighbors. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there's a lot of ways in which secular culture has its own challenges.
Let's talk about secular societies. You contrasted Jamaica and Denmark very nicely in here.
Well, thanks. I used those as a starting point, as a springboard, and that's trying to address this bigger question of, the truth is, again, this is trying to counter many Americans' fears that, oh no, the rise of secular people, this is a bad thing, this is detrimental, secularism is amoral, it's going to create a horrible society. And this is something that not only people think, but our pundits proclaim. I mean, the Bill O'Reillys, the Sean Hannitys are constantly saying that, religion is the only way to have a good society, and without it, everything descends into chaos. And I simply want to counter that claim and say, well, actually, if you look at the world, the statistics and the facts speak otherwise. So, for example, simple. It's very easy to list, the least God-believing countries in the world today and the most God-believing countries in the world today, or the countries with the highest rates of church attendance and the countries with the lowest rates of church attendance. And what we find is then you can pick any measure you want: STD rates, teen pregnancy rates, murder rates, poverty rates, corruption rates, whatever you want. And what you will find on almost every single indicator of societal health, the more secular countries fare better than the more religious. Now, I'm not saying that's because they're secular, and I'm not saying the poor, violent societies on earth today are that way because they're religious. I'm just simply trying to make the counterclaim that, you know what, secularism is not detrimental to society, and religion isn't always a panacea that people think it is. Look at Jamaica, one of the more religious countries in the Western world, has one of the most violent crime rates, one of the most highest murder rates, poverty rates, corruption rates. Look at Denmark. It's one of the least religious countries in the Western world. It has the lowest murder rates, lowest corruption levels, most equality. It's very wealthy and peaceful. So I just am kind of throwing that out there because I don't think a lot of Americans realize this, and it's something that needs to be brought to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the poor, struggling, vulnerable, and violent nations like Haiti, El Salvador, Colombia, Liberia, Zimbabwe, or the Philippines being higher in religious practice, whereas Norway, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and Australia, high levels of prosperity and secularity is more prominent there.
Indeed. And if I had to sort of really nail it down, I'd probably lean on the side of saying, secularity doesn't cause good, productive, wealthy, safe societies, but it's probably the other way around. When countries have healthy democracies, peaceful situations, well-functioning governments, health care, child care, good education, when people are sort of safe and secure in their lives, and there's jobs, and there's the things that we need, then the desire to be religious tends to go down, or the need for religion tends to go down. And conversely, societies that are more chaotic, that have more crime, more inequality, more poverty, obviously those people are going to be drawn more to religion, not only just in terms of psychological comfort, but in the very real, tangible benefits you can get from religious congregation.
Mm-hmm. So that compares countries to countries, but in the U.S., by region, depending on the degree of belief in God, we see that they tend to fare better than the more theistic states.
Yeah, and I did that because, when I was talking to people about these country-to-country comparisons, everybody said, well, you can't compare Jamaica and Denmark. They're too different. You can't compare Scandinavia and Japan to the United States. They're too different. I said, okay, fair enough. Well, there's two things we can do with that. Well, let's look within the same country. So I took the United States. We got our nice little 50 states here. So I just simply took the 10 most God-believing states in America, according to Pew Research, and the 10 least God-believing states. So the states that have the lowest levels of atheism and the states that have the highest levels of atheism. Well, the correlation still held. The least God-believing states in this country fare better when it comes to wealth, educational attainment, lower crime rates, more participants in democracy, in the democratic process, whatever measure, lower STD rates, lower teen pregnancy rates, lower obesity rates, lower domestic violence rates. And yet when I looked at the 10 most God-believing states, with the exception of Utah, which is the outlier, all the others are plagued by the most societal problems, from poverty to inequality to unemployment to alcohol abuse, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm not making the claim that these things are caused by one or the other. These are all just correlations, but they are correlations which fly against the assertions of the Sean Hannitys and Bill O'Reillys and Ann Coulters and whatnot that we need religion to have a good society. That's clearly not the case.
Mm-hmm. And you do allow for the correlation not applying to all societies. You mentioned the atheist societies of Stalin's Soviet Union and Pol Pot's Cambodia being outliers in that regard between secularity and societal goodness.
Some of the worst societies of the 20th century were ruled by atheist dictators. There's no question, from Albania to former Soviet Union to Cambodia under Pol Pot. I mean, these brutal communist atheist dictatorships have been nightmares. But we have to make a distinction then. We have to make a distinction between societies where atheism is forced on a captive population by raving dictators that don't allow for freedom of speech, that don't allow for freedom of the press, that don't allow for freedom of conscience. Those societies are nightmares. as all unfree societies are, whether they're religious or secular in nature. However, we got to compare those kind of like coercively secular societies with organically secular societies. These are societies where religion is not repressed, people are free to be religious, there's an open democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and people just stop losing interest in religion. So it's not that they're being forced or penalized or punished for being religious, they just don't care anymore. Places like Great Britain, places like the Netherlands, places like Estonia, where religion exists in abundance, freely, democratically, and people are just simply walking away from it. And that's the kind of secular society that seems to be thriving the best, and not those obviously awful communist atheist dictatorship situations.
Good. So you argue that a weakening of religion is not detrimental or dangerous to society, but you also point out in the history of humankind that there were philosophers in even some of the most ancient countries who were very much irreligious or atheistic or agnostic. I mean, we can go back to India.
That's right.
Ancient Greece.
The Charvak of India, 2,700 years ago, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China. I guess I just wanted people to know that atheism didn't emerge from Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. You know, that we do talk about the new atheism, and yet almost every bullet point you can find in the corpus of the new atheism has its historical predecessors. Way back when, thousands of years ago, you had people who were skeptical of religious teachings, who did not believe in the gods. Even in Islamic culture, going back to the 9th century, you have early voices of skepticism, disbelief, and I just wanted a brief sort of charting of that in my book, just to provide readers with some historical depth. The only difference is those voices were pretty isolated. They were tiny drops in an otherwise sea of religion. So yes, you can find this particular writing from this particular philosopher way back when, here and there, but they never constituted a sociological mass. They were just the sort of musings of individual philosophers here and there. What we have today, in 2014 and 15, is hundreds of millions of people living their lives without religion. We now, for the first time, have some countries where secularity is more predominant than religiosity, so that to be a believer is to be the minority. Places like Estonia, Czech Republic, Japan. So that's something new. So yes, there have always been these voices going way back when, but the current situation is really unprecedented.
I also found it interesting to look at the range of beliefs amongst the religious versus the irreligious, and it really is a whole spectrum. I was interested in the story about Sally, who doesn't raise her kids with religion. She doesn't believe in the God of Catholicism, but she believes in something that provides love and hope and infinity and transcendence. And I think it's important to recognize that not everyone neatly fits as an atheist or an agnostic or secular, that they're sort of along a continuum.
There is a range, absolutely, and most people are religious in many aspects and secular in others. No one's, completely one or the other, or I shouldn't say no one, very few people. And there's a lot of gray, there's a lot of purple, there's a lot in between. You bet.
Mm-hmm. So you also mention an association of more traditional evangelical Christianity with the Republican view. How does that affect politics in general?
Well, I think one of the biggest changes in the last 25 years or so is this strong marriage between conservative Christians and the Republican Party. It wasn't always so. You look back at Ronald Reagan, for example. Yes, he was a churchgoer and a Christian himself, but he wasn't as embedded or tied to these evangelical constituencies. Today, it's almost as if the Republican Party and conservative Christians are one. There are a few exceptions here and there. Not every evangelical Christian is Republican. Not every Republican is a right-wing evangelical Christian. But it's staked out that somebody staked out that territory. I don't know if it was the evangelical Christians who smelled an opportunity in the Republican Party, or the Republican Party who smelled an opportunity with conservative Christians. But I think that's going to come at a cost. I think it's very beneficial in certain regards in terms of mobilizing voters, in sort of swaying certain hot-button culture war issues. But in the end, I don't think it's wise for any political party to be too too tied with one particular religious worldview. The bottom line is we're a pluralistic democracy. There's more non-believers than ever before. There's rising rates of non-Christians, and so I do think the ramifications there are huge. And in fact, many people would argue that the rise of secularism itself in America is partly a response to or reaction against this rise of the religious right.
Indeed. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. We've been talking with Dr. Phil Zuckerman, who wrote the book Living the Secular Life. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.